I don't think there's a battery in it right now, but what happens when you walk by, she starts singing. And if you don't know it's coming, it freaks you out. Kelley, how's it going?
Great.
Great. So we got to know each other when you were at the American Conservative, and you were the director or something there?
Executive editor.
Yeah. And we had done a lot of work together on the never-ending war in Afghanistan and all of the other wars and all of that stuff, an issue that's very near to my heart. And you have a new gig now.
Yes.
What are you doing?
Well, I'm at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And so I have a couple hats there, but I'm working on building their brand because they're fairly new, about a year old. And they're a think tank that's devoted to ending endless wars, sort of demilitarizing U.S. foreign policy, rethinking, our whole role in the world. And they want to make this a transpartisan enterprise. So this is not devoted to any partisan audience. We want to bring the people on the left and the right together because we know we have common ground, as you know, on this issue. So we have a bunch of scholars who are working on, regional analysis, but also talking about grand strategy and literally changing the military-industrial complex and the way Americans see, what our role is in the world.
I was reading an article that you had retweeted, I think today, about how it is that the entire industry that thrives off of war is funding the think tank industrial complex here in D.C. And it reminded me of years ago when I was still representing the Tea Party. I was going on Fox News Sunday, and they were going to talk about the presidential election in 2016. But before they did, they were also going to talk about Syria. And I'm not an expert on Syria. I now know where Aleppo is. Thanks to
nice reference there.
thanks to Gary Johnson.
Yeah.
But I wanted a quick study from sort of a non-interventionist libertarian point of view that was current to that week, and there was literally nothing out there. So I had to basically do an all-nighter to figure out what was going on in Syria, because everything I would read was advocating in invading Syria and putting troops on the ground. So it's exciting to me to see that there's at least one think tank.
Yeah,
there may be
really
others
exciting
now as well.
And I think that you really put your finger on it. I mean, this city, Washington, D.C., is dominated by these pro-establishment, status quo think tanks that are fueled with defense money, with government money, with foreign money. And basically their whole being or their whole entire motivation is upholding, the failed strategies of the last several decades. And there, it has gotten to a groupthink in this town where we don't question, or at least they don't question, whether or not that they have been propping up failed, thinking, failed strategy all these years, because it's always been like that. It's been a consensus approach and point of view. And so what Quincy is trying to do is break through that, and not only through scholarship and, an intellectual foundation, but they want to go toe to toe with the neoconservatives, with the liberal interventionists, because let's face it, you have Brookings and CNAS on one side, and you have Heritage and FDD on the other side. And, they might differ in their approach. They might differ on the countries they want to drop bombs on and intervene in and meddle in, but they're really just upholding, like I said, that military-industrial complex, the sort of the ferment of the last 70 years. And it's just they have different agendas, whereas we want to go toe-to-toe with either side of those and say, no, we need to pull it all down, and we have to rethink everything root and branch.
I forgot that we are drinking tonight, a tradition on Kibbe on Liberty, and we were doing something new tonight. We're drinking Chardonnay, which I love, which is news to my guests. I talk a lot about beer and bourbon, but We're drinking Chardonnay tonight, per the guest's request.
Well, and thank you for the request of ice, which I'm sure your viewers are looking on in horror, which is great for the Halloween theme. But that's what I'm going to prefer right now.
Judging me, yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
And I feel like we need a stiff drink because we're going to talk about some fairly depressing things.
Yes.
Namely, the state of foreign policy and American politics and the seeming utter lack of principled non-interventionists left, right, anywhere on the political spectrum, with the notable exception of libertarians. But an article that you wrote that just cemented everything for me, because I had noticed that, at some point very early on, the Never Trumper movement and the neoconservative movement became one and the same. And I didn't see anybody, as someone personally that criticizes Trump quite a bit, I would never call myself a Never Trumper simply because I don't want to associate with people that seem almost exclusively focused on expanding the war state.
Exactly.
And trampling our civil liberties and all the things that you and I have been fighting our entire careers. This is, I think, one of your first articles for Responsible Statecraft.org or .com?
.org.
.org.
Right. So that's our sort of news website, our forward-facing website for the Quincy Institute. So it's daily, fare, news articles, reporting.
Why these four-star generals can't lecture us about morality and truth. And it is a pretty harsh litany of all of these generals that have come out and called out Trump in just, I think shockingly political ways. I'm not used to seeing the military, retired or otherwise, getting so engaged in politics, and the way that Colin Powell and the generals and all of these guys are marching lockstep, really speaking the sort of the radical progressive language of he's threatening our democracy. Right. They're not always wrong about their criticism. I saw one of the generals criticized Trump for sending troops presumably into Portland, Oregon, I believe, and I agree with that particular critique.
Right.
But let's talk about this, and I want to lay out, you laid out some numbers here that are worth discussing before we get into the generals, because as you were saying, like, there's no think tank that actually points out the fact that we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and no one says, isn't this crazy? But $6.4 trillion, that is the number presumably for the war on terror, primarily Afghanistan and Iraq. Is that correct?
Correct. And all of the attending costs, whether it be veterans' health care costs. So that includes not only direct funding for the wars in country, but everything, everything that's cost us fiscally in our budgets, whether it be HHS, whether it be VA, whether it be, community-wide. I mean, that's a very comprehensive, I believe I got that from the Cost of War Project at Brown University.
Yeah.
So they include everything. That gives you the price tag right there.
Yeah. Well, I bet you the number is even bigger, because when I saw that number, I was reminded of the ancient days when Tea Party Republicans were trying to balance the budget, and I was very much part of that movement. I'm of those quaint days when we thought that balancing the budget and maybe not spending trillions and trillions of dollars we didn't have was a good idea.
Yeah.
And the Achilles heel of Republican efforts to balance the budget were the caps on military spending. We were never going to win that fight because the Democrats understood that as long as the Republicans wanted to spend endlessly on the war on terror and military intervention, they could just keep bidding up the price.
Right.
So we used to have guns versus butter. Now we have guns and butter.
And butter.
And more guns and surveillance and things we don't even know about.
Right. And you also include within that 6.4 trillion number, are the other agencies that are fueling the national security state, which would be not only the Pentagon, but the Justice Department, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security. I mean, I used to look into these budgets and see, wow, I didn't know we were funding military this or drone that, or, you name it, numerous programs or surveillance programs that had nothing to do with the Pentagon. But they were all under the rubric of homeland security or defense in general.
Yeah.
So it's incredible.
More important than dollars or treasure, 8,600 U.S. military dead, not counting contractors. And that's primarily Iraq and Afghanistan, I assume.
Right. Both countries, and I don't know if I added in there the over 50,000 wounded.
Yeah.
And I like to point out that, the same injuries that these guys and gals were getting in this war, they were actually dying from in Vietnam. It's just that we have a sophisticated triage now where we can get somebody off a battlefield and get them into Germany within a few hours and start operating. And so a lot of our soldiers came home with multiple health problems that will last them a lifetime, and they would have died, 45 years ago. So when you say 50,000 wounded, those could be 50, it could be tens of thousands of actual deaths if we didn't have, the medical advancements we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad we have them, but just to put it in perspective for people that, these guys weren't just coming back with, scratches and, bandages around their head. They were coming home with brain injuries and, limbs missing, in many cases. So.
And we've talked about this before. The state of the veterans' hospitals is so horrific and unjust and shocking. Even like you take those two facts together.
Yeah.
That we keep producing these extraordinarily damaged soldiers, bring them back, and then put them through this meat grinder. It's really. Ugh.
And they weren't prepared. I remember doing a story when we invaded Iraq and talking to veterans advocates, and they said the VA is not prepared to bring, to take in the influx of these veterans. And wouldn't you know, just a few years later, they were getting all these guys with myriad injuries and also PTSD. And then you started hearing all the stories about the wait lists and people not being able to get an appointment, or then years later, they were just medicating people and sending them on their way because they didn't have time to actually do therapy. It's just, they weren't prepared, which is really appalling, given that, after what happened in Vietnam, you would think that they had all these years to get their act together.
Yeah.
And they didn't. Because it's a federal bureaucracy, and we know how that goes.
Well, I assume there's a lot more money making war than there is cleaning up the damage from war. 37 million refugees and hundreds of thousands of civilians dead in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere since 2002. The instability that this creates can explain a lot of the problems that are happening.
Oh, absolutely. I think, 19 years on, most of us have moved on, and they're thinking about the war. It's sort of not in your face in the news, in the headlines. What we talk about, we don't, we're not, as intimately involved in, watching veterans coming home at the airports. But you look at the domino effect of our invasions and our meddling and our interventions, the drone war, which is still continuing. We can go into that in places like Somalia. Trump has instigated, more, air attacks, against al-Shabaab and others than even Obama, who was really breaking the mold. But all that said, I mean, there's just so much that we've left behind for other people to contend with, whether it be the refugees in the refugee camps, whether it be the environmental issues that you see in Iraq with all sorts of the toxins in the, not just the earth but in the water. I mean, so you have babies being born with birth defects. I mean, this could go on, and we just walked away because we feel untouched by it personally.
Yeah. Well, we don't even seem to think about it that much. And you wrote about this in another article, that the train wreck of the one presidential debate never mentioned foreign policy, as far as I remember. And the vice presidential debate did a little bit, but they fell back into their sort of stereotype platitudes without even talking. It's funny that the Democratic Party is now accusing the Republican Party of being isolationist.
Yeah.
It's all very confusing to me.
It's very confusing.
And to accuse Mike Pence, who clearly is a different guy than Donald Trump when it comes to foreign policy, he probably falls much more in line with more of a neoconservative ideology. But no one really talks about it because we Americans don't feel that pain perhaps the same way we did in Vietnam during the draft.
No. Absolutely not. And I think that the quote I most often hear is that 0.5% of the U.S. population actually fought the war. And what people don't understand is that small, tiny figure, they're still fighting the war. They've been redeployed over and over and over again. You might not hear about it, and they're not in the same harm's way they might have been in 2004 or 2012 in Afghanistan, but these families are being affected greatly. And I've talked with veterans families, not veterans families, but active duty members, and they say, they just don't have any stability in their family, in their community life, because dad or mom is rotating in and out and in and out, and it's just sort of like a bad drama for them. And they know in their hearts that the rest of the country is pretty much forgotten about them because they just assume that the war is over and everybody's moved on. But it really does affect these military communities. And that's why you see a growing number of, I think it's a vast majority at this point in the 70s, of veterans who are saying that it's time to come home from Afghanistan and pull all the troops home from Iraq. So one would think that the military community, particularly those who fought, would be in most support of finishing things up there. But they're just like, it wasn't worth it. Let's get out of there. And if that doesn't send a message, I really don't know what does.
Yeah, but the rank and file military support for someone like Ron Paul was tremendous for that very reason, because they didn't listen to the politicians in Washington. They saw what we were actually doing on the ground, and realized the hopelessness at least and the destructiveness of what we were doing. But obviously, there's a big difference between the rank and file who are on the ground taking the bullets, literally, and the generals who conducted those campaigns. And I want to go through that, but I think it's fascinating to me the way that the Biden campaign almost exclusively, not 100%, but exclusively, is gathering all of the war hawks in both political parties. And I'm not sure they're that political. I think they're either making a cynical bet that Biden's going to win, so they want to be there to make sure he continues conducting these wars.
Yes.
Or that Joe Biden himself is potentially far more aggressive on foreign policy from their point of view than Donald Trump is. I don't know which is true, but there's a pattern either way.
Yeah, there's definitely a pattern, and what I see is in everything you just described is true, but I'll take it a step further. I think that they see Donald Trump as somebody who threatens, their not only their lifestyle and their worldview, but their very being. And that sounds pretty dramatic, but when you think about it, when you look at Donald Trump, he comes in, he's an outsider, he wants to tear everything down, he wants to get out of wars, he doesn't talk their language, he doesn't ascribe to the same Washington hierarchy and food chain. He just has ground it all up. And they look at him and they're frightened. They're frightened and disgusted. There's a lot of snobbery going on there too, I would imagine. And so they want to go back. They want to return to the full-on embrace of the national security state, to the worldview of American primacy abroad. They don't want any talk about pulling troops out and renegotiating security agreements and getting out of NATO and supporting strong men like Erdogan or Viktor Orban. All this makes them very nervous. And so they see Biden as just sort of a return to the status quo. And I feel that the way that they've gone about it, which is ascribing all sorts of horrors to Trump, that he's immoral, that he's dangerous, that he's basically ripping up the Constitution or he's destroying the Republic. I find that not only hyperbolic, but I find it disingenuous because I feel like their motivations are a lot more self-serving than that. And I think if the American people, most Americans can probably see through that. But when the media is giving these generals and ascribing them to like near sainthood, it just gets under my skin because I see the motivations, you see the motivations, but the media makes these guys look like, well, they're paragons of virtue.
Yeah.
They're going after the bad guy, like Saint George the Dragon Slayer.
It's so hypocritical because
Right.
many of those same media outlets, when these generals were serving, certainly George W. Bush, but Barack Obama as well, they would demonize them, and so like it's all a political game, and I'm not even sure who's trying to get at what.
Right.
Except it seems like through all of this chaos, the military-industrial complex thrives.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about some of these guys. Admiral Bill McRaven, and he was... Anyway, I'll let you talk about him because I think you know this better than I do.
Right. So Bill McRaven took over the Joint Special Operations Command from Stanley McChrystal during the mid-2000s. I want to say 2008, but I'm not so sure. I too have lost the grasp of a lot of these granular details about the war because we're so far removed or seemingly from it. But what bothered me about Bill McRaven, who came out full-throatedly against Trump, he was, basically a threat to democracy, truth, virtue, whatever. What bothers me is that he had led what we all, call colloquially, a kill team in Iraq. These were manhunters. These guys would pick up detainees all over the battle space, throw them in these jails and dark rooms, and do whatever they felt was necessary without due process, obviously, and then let them go because they were picked up because so-and-so is sort of tattletaling on them or had some sort of local gripe. These were people who earned their stripes, earned their reputation by manhunting.
Yeah.
And most Americans say, well, we were fighting terrorists and that's the way to go. But when you look at it, it was violating all of our American values in terms of the rule of law all over the place. And I find it just very hypocritical and disingenuous where somebody like that is lecturing me about truth and morality. So he goes on to become the head of JSOC in Afghanistan, where you had all of these rough riding, special ops guys doing these midnight raids, kicking down doors, killing civilians in the crosshairs. There was one particular Gardez incident where they killed a bunch of civilians, including women and children, and then tried to cover it up and say the Taliban did it, and McRaven had to come in. I'm not saying he was part of that raid, but he had to come in and apologize, offered the locals a goat or something. I don't know. I mean, it's all of these bizarre details of the war that people have forgotten. Then he went on to work with, the Obama administration, basically identifying terrorists that needed to be wiped out in the new and burgeoning drone program, along with John Brennan, who we now know is another MSNBC saint.
Yeah.
So I feel a bit
The
appalled.
guy that curated Barack Obama's kill list is now a superstar on MSNBC, former
Right.
CIA director Brennan.
Right.
And to sort of wrap yourself in the Constitution now seems...
Exactly, because even that kill list, I mean, the ACLU had to fight tooth and nail just to get that kill list out.
Yeah.
This wasn't something that the Obama proudly shared with the American people. It wasn't transparent at all. And it wasn't until almost the end of his presidency that any of this had come out. And then we find out people like McRaven and Brennan were right there as the side identifying targets for what I believe was not only an illegal but an immoral program. So I don't want to be lectured by him.
Yeah. General Stanley McChrystal.
Well, he was the JSOC, manhunter par excellence. So he was the first, highly regarded as, a manhunter, a tough guy, warrior monk, whatever you want to call him. He was in charge during particular gross revelations about a detention center called Camp Nama in Iraq, where detainees were brought in and tortured. Nobody did anything about it. It was investigated. The military denied it. When McChrystal was brought up for confirmation, when he was nominated to be or appointed as commander of Afghan forces, the media barely touched him on it, and which was really appalling to me at the time, because you talk about how the media kind of toggles back and forth, but they really do treat these generals with kid gloves. So there was some things written, whether it be in Rolling Stone or the Atlantic or things that I was writing at the time, but it really didn't harm him. And then he becomes the commander of all the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And as you know, or you remember, Michael Hastings wrote this wonderful book about the operators. He included, or it was excerpted for a piece in the Rolling Stone, The Runaway General, that actually got McChrystal fired. Mm-hmm. Not fired for doing anything, against human rights or violating the Constitution, but he made disparaging comments about the president and Joe Biden. But in that book, which, I've read carefully a few times, he does convey some real doubt about the mission in Afghanistan, and it really becomes clear that he's fighting it because he sees it as part of this sort of more about the brotherhood of the military, and fighting it because of, as part of this separate world, of the military, rather than the actual goals of what we were supposed to be doing in Afghanistan. Yet he pushes Barack Obama to surge 40,000 more troops into that country at a time when a lot of troops were coming back with severe injuries, pelvic injuries, because they were walking over IEDs. So I feel like he, for political reasons, for self-interested reasons, on behalf of the military, he put tens of thousands of more U.S. troops into harm's way. And again, I don't want to be lectured by someone like that.
General Michael Hayden, former head of the National Security Administration.
This guy drives me nuts. Not only after 9/11 does he lead the most egregious violation of American civil liberties by giving his blessing to the warrantless wiretapping program, he then becomes CIA director, in which he defends torture. So on two fronts, whether it's sort of ripping away, our Fourth Amendment here on, domestic soil, but then he goes and defends CIA operatives who are waterboarding. They're shoving feeding tubes down people's throats at Guantanamo. They're sensory deprivation, punching, slapping, whatever is going on there. And he defends it and says, well, and then when he's really pressed by the committee, because this all came out in the Senate committee where they actually had reams of evidence. This wasn't just a bunch of human rights activists who were contending. The Senate Committee on Torture basically compiled all this evidence, and he basically contradicted himself. He contradicted his own people. And then at the end, he said, well, this is all, I'm just acting on information from people below me, and if you don't like it, fire them. So actually, then he turns around and says, well, Donald Trump doesn't believe in facts. Well, I'm not sure that Michael Hayden believed in facts either. And to me, torture at the level that had been conducted in this war in our name is a lot more damning and egregious than some of the goofy stuff that Trump has done or that he has been accused of doing. And I'm sorry, I'm weighing both of them. I'm thinking I'm not going to take, moral advice, or I'm not going to look to Michael Hayden, for as a moral compass at all.
James Mattis, otherwise known as Mad Dog.
Yes.
I don't trust anyone named Mad Dog, by the way. It's just a gut instinct I have.
What makes me angry about James Mattis is that he represents the revolving door in Washington and in the military-industrial complex. So, he goes from, being a, 4-star general, revolves immediately into the defense industry, sits on the board of General Dynamics, takes money from other big defense contractors to give speeches. He's basically cashing in, on his legacy as a 4-star general, which many do. Scores of them, according to one study by the Project on Government Oversight, just in the last few years, have cashed in by going into, this is common knowledge. But the fact that he goes and then he turns around, is appointed as, Secretary of Defense by Trump, in which he immediately starts advocating in the way they do for the same people that he was representing and taking speaking engagement money for, while he was on the private side. And that, what best illustrates it is that this Congress actually grew a backbone at one point and voted to get out of the war in Yemen, meaning they wanted us to stop assisting Saudi Arabia with bombs and targeting and refueling because they are killing civilians there indiscriminately with our bombs. And Trump vetoed it. Why? Because Mattis and other, brass in the military said, no, we have to keep doing this. But some of those bombs were made by General Dynamics. They found the fragments on the ground in these civilian hellholes where they were just ripping apart school buses and hospitals. And so it just, when you see a pattern of somebody who is representing the interests of War Inc., I called, and then they revolve back into the public space where they're supposed to be representing the American people, but no, they're representing War Inc. Now he revolves back out and is basically out there crying in cathedrals, saying how terrible the president is. Again, I just can't take moral lectures from people like that.
The trend of we've talked previously about the President Trump's questionable hiring practices when it comes to military advisors, and he seems to churn and burn through them. We've spent Rand Paul and I spent a good portion of the show talking about John Bolton, who, other than his spectacular mustache, has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. But there is this pattern in the Trump administration where these tough guy generals go in, don't really get what they want, and then they
Right.
leave. And they don't say they're leaving because they didn't get to invade Syria. They say they're leaving for some other reason.
That's right. And as you know, good point on that, because another thing, and I think I included this in the article, was that James Mattis not only didn't leave because, you know, he was brokenhearted over all those dead children in Yemen. He left because Trump wanted to get out of Syria, and he didn't agree with that. At least that's the excuse he was given. I think, you know, when President Trump took over, I think he was awestruck by generals. I think he was overwhelmed by them, like many people are. But he has this, you know, inferiority complex to begin with. And I think that he was pretty much awed by their ribbons and their medals. And he was happy to bring them on because it gave him gravitas. It made him look strong on an area of policy that he had absolutely no experience in. And I think down the road, they weren't doing what he wanted. They weren't behaving the way he wanted. They were probably pretty condescending to him. Like I said, Trump is not one of them. And I'm sure that's come out, and in many ways. Now, I'm not gonna say that Bob Woodward and his books about, you know, these meetings where Trump just totally lost it and embarrassed himself, and I'm not saying any of that's true or not true, and I have no special insights, but I think what happened was there was probably a break, and there continues to be a break, because Trump doesn't like people who look down on him, and Trump is never going to get his way fully in the military-industrial complex. No president does. No defense secretary typically does. They usually just have to roll with it, and I think Trump is more comfortable with having political, you know, friends and people who don't stand up to him. And so he's been populating different positions within the Pentagon with, you know, people who are outside of that orbit. And that's making it worse. And for folks like me and you, it's not very good, because the people he's putting in there are typically people who are just business friendly. So they're all about, like, yeah, let's get those arms deals going, you know. So he's not putting non-interventionists in there. He's just kind of putting people who are closer to his sort of Wall Street way of thinking, and it's created some serious tensions. And I think that, you know, this election it's just shown that 500, you know, retired military brass are signing, you know, endorsement for Biden, compared to the 235 that Trump got. I mean, it's literally an arms race. It means nothing because nobody really cares, but it does show you that more of these guys are willing to go on the record and on television bad mouthing the president, because they clearly they see the writing on the wall, and they're like, this guy's got to go.
One that's I only want to talk about two more guys because the list is exhaustible, and we would spend like 6 hours doing it. But one that I find particularly ironic in 2020 with the modern progressive movement and what I would almost call a bipartisan consensus that the drug war has been a disaster. Not a consensus, but the consensus with the American people, not Washington, D.C.
Right, exactly.
But Barry McCaffrey, who was the drug czar under the Clinton years, he is now being celebrated as a hero.
Yeah.
Do we not remember?
No, we don't remember. I think the Clinton people, on the most part, are happy that we don't remember, because when you really think about it, you know, they were pretty hardcore. And this whole triangulation thing is real. And they did pass that crime bill in 1994 that screwed everything up. They were the champions of the zero tolerance policy. You know, Barry McCaffrey was not about, rehabilitating, substance abusers. He was all for throwing them into jail. I mean, I'm sure he's come along over the years, but he was being paid, and his agency was being funded with millions of dollars to basically wage a war. And that not only includes the domestic war against drugs, but it also includes, the war on drugs in South America and Latin America, where we basically funded our own military to go down there and work with very sketchy, very questionable forces against other very sketchy forces, and created all sorts of violence that we're living with today. When we see these migrations of people coming up and trying to get into our country, it's because of violence that we actually spurred on with the drug war.
Yeah. My friends in Honduras who run a liberty-based think tank there, which is where the caravans that a lot of conservatives were so upset about, they talk about how the drug war in the United States, intervention and meddling, has empowered drug gangs and destroyed the rule of law. And we forget these stories, and we think we don't know why people are coming across the border, but it was that crime bill and that war on drugs,
right,
from Clinton and Joe Biden.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just saying that I think, MSNBC and the others are just banking on just the ignorance of their viewers, or they're taking their ignorance for granted, that we don't remember what Barry McCaffrey represents, or John Brennan represents, or Michael Hayden represents. I mean, these were periods in this country where, we really could fear that our civil liberties were being violated, that our constitutional rights were being violated. I mean, for real. And yet we have all of these hyperbolic statements about Trump violating liberties, and they can't really point to a single edict or legislation or whatever order that would actually rise to the level of what we saw in the Patriot Act, for example.
Yeah. So I'm going to age myself with this one, but I still have an axe to grind with Colin Powell, because I remember Kuwait. And not just because of the line in The Big Lebowski where the president says this unchecked aggression will not stand. And I remember Colin Powell being an engineer at the very early days of the war on terror. And he is on his high horse right now.
Yeah.
How dare Trump be Trump?
And I feel bad because I think Colin Powell, of all of these guys, had a lot of goodwill, a lot of credibility all the way up until he made that speech in the UN, delivering the evidence and the justification for the U.S. invasion of Iraq, that Saddam Hussein had WMDs. And not only did he do that, which unleashed everything that we've talked about so far here, but then, he wrote a book afterwards saying he had misgivings about that speech all along. And Larry Wilkinson, who is his chief of staff, he's a great guy. He's a non-interventionist today, great speaker, will confirm all the details of that conversation. He was concerned about the vigorousness of the evidence, but yet he was pressured by Cheney's people, Vice President Dick Cheney's people, to go forward with that speech. And he was a good soldier, and he did it. And we love Colin Powell because he's a good soldier, but this is one of those cases where his good soldiering just basically took his reputation and flushed it down the toilet. And he knows that. And so he used to be considered a sort of a possible presidential candidate at one time. He actually kind of hedged for a while before all of this because he didn't want to be political. And now I think he just can't do it because of that baggage. And now it just seems like he's just thrown in with the Never Trumpers. And I think most people, especially our age, are looking at him and going, really? Why we really want to take anything you say seriously, even if we don't support Trump.
Yeah.
But why would we take you seriously?
I suppose it could be, and I have no idea what his motives are, but it strikes me that being vocally and even hysterically anti-Trump right now is a great way to reimagine your reputation and your career, right, and get a contract with mainstream media.
Well, in the mainstream media, and then you think of all those other people who are sort of jockeying for a possible position in the future Biden administration, which makes me pretty nervous because I'm looking at the people who are surrounding Biden right now on his foreign policy and national security advisory teams. I'm looking at these never Trumpers who are currying all this favor with the inner circle of Biden. And they're all either neocons or interventionists or the people who were part of the entire failed war policies beginning in 2001 until this day. Because let's face it, all of the failure is shared by both Democrats and Republicans. And those are the people who are rising to the top. And it's Washington culture. They see an opportunity. And it kind of makes people like us sick because, we're sort of rooted in principle, but these guys aren't. And that's why these never Trumpers, I don't want to give them the time of day because they're not even really Republicans. They're definitely not conservatives. They're just political animals. But they have this sanctimony to them that it just totally gets under my skin. I could see I have nothing against political animals. I mean, people make their livelihood any way they want. I mean, it makes the world go around. But the smugness and the arrogance and the sanctimony really turns me off.
And you just ably described the Washington machine that keeps us in a perpetual war. And I want to go back to and kind of wrap up on the mission of the Quincy Institute. There does seem to be outside the Beltway a very different environment where people. I don't remember the latest poll, but people do want us to get out of Afghanistan, and people do want to see a more reasonable, rational foreign policy. But they're not political pros, and they're not going to spend all their time holding the machine in Washington to account. And there's sort of a public choice argument here. Is we keep doing the thing that the public doesn't want us to do in Washington, D.C. because it pays well to keep bombing countries. And the president has said, and he seems aware of what the American people want. And he keeps falling back to, we got to get out of Afghanistan. We got to get out of Afghanistan. A couple days ago, Rand Paul had a conversation with him and tweeted out, the president has said we will be out of Afghanistan by December 31st of this year. And immediately one of his generals went on, I don't know what, probably MSNBC.
Probably.
And said, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So is he really trying to get us out of Afghanistan? Is he manipulating us, or is he surrounded by this machine that just doesn't move?
Yeah, I think he's surrounded by this machine that doesn't move. And the greatest resistance to Trump fulfilling his promises to get out of these endless wars is the military and the accompanying blob, I call it, the whole foreign policy establishment that is just, completely focused on the status quo. I honestly think, and this is as somebody who hasn't supported President Trump, but I think he actually put his finger on the pulse of where people were in 2016. They were tired of war. They were tired of seeing their taxes just go into a black hole and in the federal government, the federal trough, and then off to these foreign lands, billions of dollars of foreign aid, billions of dollars, trillions in fighting these wars, and then being told they're a failure. Now we have ISIS. Now we have Al-Shabaab. We have more terrorists in Afghanistan than when we started, and it's just a fatigue. And it's natural. And I feel that at the time in 2016, people were more concerned about the economy, the jobs, this income inequality that was becoming more and more apparent. And Washington was becoming more and more removed and disconnected from people's real lives. And they saw this elite in Washington, this swamp. I felt like all that together, he really spoke for those people, just like I do feel that Bernie Sanders spoke for those people too. And part of that was ending these wars. Now, you come back to Washington, they're like, yeah, okay, it's like a pat on the head. We'll get out of these wars, and then it's business as usual for the next 4 years. And even when you have Congress, who are supposed to be representing the people, voting against the war in Yemen and voting against, Saudi arms sales, You know, the president, pushed by his own military, vetoes these things. And so it's a big disappointment. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna stand here and say that Trump has done what he promised to do, that, it's all coming from this, this part of his soul that's meaningful. I don't even care. I don't even think he thinks about human rights, or the values that are represented when we go off in these wars. I can't speak for that, but I can speak for this disconnect that you mentioned between the people and what's going on in this swamp here.
Yeah, he's just trying to cut a deal with the American people. He's a deal maker, and he's smart enough to read where they want to be.
Exactly.
And at least that's true with him.
Yeah.
But I think it's implausible to me that he does get us out of Afghanistan by the end of the year. I wish he would. I hope he would. But
yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know if it's logistically possible. And I think with these negotiations going on, I think they're so fragile right now that I think him going out there and saying, guess what, everybody's coming back for Christmas, I don't think that helps. I think if he does win another term, there's a good chance these guys could come home. I do think so. I think if he keeps pushing it, I think that there is enough energy in it coming from the Quincy Institute and other groups, other interests in Washington that have said, and I'm surprised at how many people are now acknowledging the failures of Afghanistan in the foreign policy world, that it just might happen. I might not have said the same thing a year or two ago, but I'm really feeling this shift in attitudes among the blob, that they know that where they put their finger up to the wind and they realize that the Afghanistan is a losing battle for them, or whatever organization they represent. It's not happening. The Afghanistan papers that the Washington Post had published, earlier this year, basically, exposed all of the lies. And I think they had over 100 people had spoken to the special inspector general there off the record. The Washington Post got the interviews, but basically over 100 officials interviewed said it's a failure. It's not going to work. Whether it be, the Afghan forces or the money we were pouring into reconstruction or whatever, over 100. And yet they never came forward and voiced these concerns publicly. It wasn't until the Washington Post actually exposed, the truths. And I think once that happened, I think it turned the tide. You hear of a mainstream paper basically saying everything's been a lie. And the American people know that. The veterans don't want to be there. The only people that want to be there is this military-industrial complex.
Thank you for ending on a more positive note. There's not a lot of positive news on this front, but the tide is turning.
Yeah. I do think it's turning, and I'm proud to be with an organization that is actually devoted to making those changes and, challenging the blob, challenging the status quo, and they want to be transpartisan about it. So one of my tasks and my goals is to bring more conservatives into the fold. People look at the right and they say, oh, they're all hawks, they're all pro-war, they're all pro-military, they're conservative Inc., as I call them. But there's a wide swath of conservatives who really are conservative. They want to conserve, and they don't want to see us wasting trillions of dollars overseas, or our troops coming home wrecked and maimed and communities harmed by that at home. They don't want to see our civil liberties violated. Those are the conservatives that we want to get at. And I believe that faction is actually growing. They might be coming from it from a libertarian perspective. They're also coming at it from more of a social traditionalist conservative mold, where they're saying localism is better, We got to start fostering our communities and families. However they're getting there, they're seeing that the endless wars are just they're just not working. We got to stop them.
Even just an American strength perspective, these things drain us and make us more vulnerable.
They make us more vulnerable, and that's definitely borne out in all of the hot spots that you see today, the Middle East, even in Europe. Just some of these ancient, archaic, alliances we have are just draining our resources, but they're not making the troops that we have out there. And we have like 500,000 troops overseas right now in 150 countries. But a lot of them are spread out in places like Africa, where we do get ambushed by insurgencies because we're spread thin, our strategies are unclear. We're there to establish lily pads and footprints, but we don't have the strength, and we shouldn't. We don't need to express this American primacy anymore. We don't need to be the American policeman anymore. But yet, administration after administration, Congress after Congress has supported this because I think they're afraid of stepping back. They're afraid of being called isolationists, which is a canard. And they're afraid to risk those campaign contributions from the defense industry as well. So there's all sorts of dynamics going on, but I think I think there is a fear of doing something different.
Yeah. How do people find out more about the Quincy Institute, and where do they find your stuff?
So they can go online to it's quincyinst.org, and they can find my stuff at responsiblestatecraft.org, which is our daily news and views site. And so we're cultivating a great group of writers on both the left and the right, some scholars, some scrappy, reporters, but that's where we're about a year old now. And so, it's got that fun feeling of being sort of like a hungry, startup. But I think we're actually making some waves out there. I mean, it's already got a great reputation. And I think it's because people recognize that this space is actually important. And it's funny, Matt, because I've been getting emails and I've seen, tweets and other missives from the more, what you would say, mainstream foreign policy world, who are actually talking our language now. They're talking about restraint, for example. They're talking about, rethinking, our foreign policy and American primacy. You wouldn't have heard that 5 years ago, even a couple years ago. So I think, I think that the Quincy Institute is sort of like at the spear point of some of that change.
Great. Thanks for finally doing this. We waited too long, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.